Welcome, Dr. Anya Foxen, to Yoga Chats with me, Adam Keen on Yoga. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you.
Your last two books are fantastic, Inhaling the Spirit and What is Yoga? Or is this yoga?
Is this yoga?
Is this yoga? Or is it yoga? Or what is yoga? But, right, I mean, without saying the obvious, right, what is yoga, right, to you? Yeah, when one's thinking about it, it isn't immediately clear. You know, I mean, I don't know, you probably do hatha yoga, you know, do yoga asana. I've done yoga asanas, so I'm here, you know, for most of my life. And then you start to think about it. You think, well, you know, okay, I felt a bit calmer, you know, I'm doing it for so-called deeper understanding of reality. But, you know, when you start to look through texts and stuff, as you rightly point out over and over again, it isn't immediately clear. And some of it, you know, a lot of the stuff, like when you quote Gordon White, actually is using yoga for particularly kind of like purposes of power and, you know, something with a more insidious aim. So, you know, where do we start if we wanted to try and write a definition of yoga?
Well, you know, I mean, my co-author and I tried in that first chapter. I mean, I think to some extent, as much as I love definitions, right? I mean, I'm an academic, like definitions are where I live a lot of the time. I don't know that that's the most productive way to go about yoga. I mean, I think, you know, by the end of the chapter, we come up with something like, you know, it's sort of about renegotiating the boundaries of the self or something like that, which is about as vague of a definition as you could possibly get.
Yeah.
I mean, I think to some extent, like to kind of rope in some of those ways that David Wyatt likes to talk about yoga, rope in, you know, I mean, all the kind of classical stuff that we normally deal with, right? Potentially rope in the modern stuff. I think that for me, it comes down to being almost sort of more about the method rather than the goal necessarily, right? It's like, what are you doing? And you may be undertaking those techniques, whether they're physical, whether they're psychological, whether they're even something beyond, right? I mean, whatever level that's functioning on, you can certainly undertake those techniques with the goal of power. Or you can undertake them with the goal of transcendence. I mean, it's sort of almost like you have to have your house in order to do either one, right? If you want power, you need to sort of get your organism right. If you want to transcend that organism, you still got to get it right before you ultimately do that. And so if we think about yoga as techniques of the body and mind, right, that kind of like put everything into order. I think that gets us a little bit of the way there.
It is so vague, isn't it? It's like trying hard at something, you know, it's like trying hard to do something, trying hard to, I mean, you know, this idea of transformation of the self is an obvious one, isn't it? Or something involved with, I mean, it always involves concentration, but then you have to qualify concentration because, you know, obviously I'm thinking about it a lot, you know, because you can't, we can concentrate on writing a book about physics or mathematics, but that isn't yoga exactly, is it? Or is it the admittance that there's something lacking in reality that makes that there's another that there, and that, you know, is it inherently a dualist perspective? Maybe that's my next foray into this question
I think
for you.
It's not, right? But
it's not. But doesn't it have to admit that there is something and another thing, and you're trying to get from one thing to another thing, so therefore yoga could be inherently dualist?
I see what you're saying. So
I don't know whether wading out too far now.
I don't think you are. I think the way that I would approach it is, I mean, fundamentally, yeah, you're right. There's some base assumption, right, that our normal, ordinary, just everyday experience of the world is kind of like not all that there is.
Yeah.
And so I think there's two ways that you could approach that, right? And it's not necessarily a kind of hard dualism where it's like there's this and then there's something else or somewhere else where we can go. I mean, you can go kind of out and over, or you can go further in, right? And so I think the other alternative, rather than saying that yoga helps get us to some other reality, is to say that yoga gets us deeper into the reality that we already inhabit, right? That those those higher states are kind of already like baked in to the world as it is. It's just that we don't normally see things that way. right? And so we have to sort of like calibrate our lens a little bit. And that's not a dualism, right? I mean, that's actually sort of a monism, like it's already all right here.
Right.
But there's still some process that needs to happen to kind of get us there.
But if I could go on about dualism for hours because I still don't fully understand it really. Because as long as you've got one and the other, or a reflexive being, or self, you've kind of potentially got dualism. And as long as we're saying there's a better and a worse, that there's something inherently lacking, and we've got something better out there, we're not involved in dualism to some degree.
Well, I think maybe where I would kind of
There's
like
a deeper
diverge
state,
from
your
way of framing it is, it's not that there's something lacking, right?
Right.
It's more that like we don't always see every aspect of our reality all at once. It doesn't mean it's not there. Right. So maybe you could say there's something lacking in our ordinary human experience of the thing. Right. But it doesn't mean that it's inaccessible to us, that it's not kind of all around us. It just means that we're not seeing it clearly, right? We're not kind of seeing the thing for what it is, which we never do. I mean, just from a purely materialistic scientific perspective, there's so much of reality, most of reality, that we never really sort of engage with, right, cognitively.
Unless you're going to take some ayahuasca or something.
Oh, exactly, right? And then it's like, ooh,
see so much more. But I don't know. Let's go on to something which really intrigued me was the idea of rigging. David White's definition of rigging. Now, I didn't, I'll play stupid here and say I don't fully understand it, because actually I didn't fully understand it. But there was something in there which is interesting, and now I've got you. Could you explain the idea of rigging a little bit more? Rigging is yoga.
I love this stuff.
It's good.
Rigging.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at when I said that. Yeah, it's about kind of refining the lens. It's about, making sure that your house is in order. The rigging metaphor, I think, really works for me because it is one of these really classic kind of ways of talking about just like the human mind-body organism that you find in ancient sources, right? I mean, these days, how often do we use this metaphor of like the computer or something like that to talk about the brain? Well, back then, right, it's like people didn't have computers. So one of the most complicated things that you have is, maybe like a ship or a chariot or something.
Chariot,
these vehicles,
horses.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like Plato's got a chariot metaphor, right?
True.
Buddhism's got a chariot metaphor.
Yeah.
Everybody's got a chariot metaphor for the self because, it's such a good
I never
metaphor.
thought about that. Yeah.
Right? Like, because it's this very sort of intricate, complex, like intertwined system of moving parts. So it really gives you these tools to kind of talk about, right? Like, how is the human being put together? And so I think that's what David's getting at with the rigging thing, right? In order for your rig, right, which originally is the sort of the boat mast kind of like that whole complicated system, in order for it to work properly, in order for it to do the thing that the boat is designed to do, you really need to sort of like be very careful, right? And very systematic and very precise in the way that everything is put together. And so the argument, I think, is that kind of, again, no matter what your goal is, the body and the mind are like that, right? They're this complex, really intricate system that if things are out of whack, right? Like in the chariot metaphor, if your horses are constantly pulling you in directions you don't want to go, like that's when the bad stuff happens, right? That's when for Plato, like the soul falls down from, the ethereal realms. Like it's that sort of, like the wonkiness within the system, right? That in a sense kind of puts us into our everyday chaotic, just the regular state of our world. And so if we rig ourselves up kind of carefully and precisely and correctly, the argument is that like the system can function in this sort of ideal way, right? To get us to whatever goal it is that we're going for.
And the goals are various, right? I mean, as we spoke before, I mean, we assume that the goal is always self-knowledge.
I think even those cases where really what you're after is power, let's say, I mean, the self-knowledge is still sort of necessary for that
Yeah, true.
to some extent, right? And so, yeah, I
Yeah,
think that's what I meant when I said it's more about it's the method, right? At least as much as the goal. That really
yeah.
there's these ways of manipulating the mind and the body, right? That sort of put us into a position to achieve whatever sort of end might not ordinarily be accessible to us, just like with our regular state of our minds and our bodies. But what that end is can vary.
Yeah, and don't you think, has yoga always been alchemical? I mean, you talk about kind of rigging the body. I mean, are we always talking about some kind of, kind of biohack, to use modern terms? Or some of it's completely cerebral?
I think so,
Right.
actually. I mean, even even the cerebral stuff is always embedded in the rest
True.
of the body, right? Like never throughout human history have we been just like free floating
Just the
brains
body,
and
just the mind.
vats,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like I mean, even if you think the more important stuff is
Well,
going on
they
somewhere
can't
deeper in
kind
the
of
mind,
believe
right?
that.
Like,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Well, so, I mean, you think, what about the actual yoga itself? Are you in belief that the Pashupati seal was a yoga posture, or just
You
a?
know, I think we honestly can't know.
Mm,
And that's kind of my bit. So I'm definitely going off of David White's argument when I address
mm.
that in the, what is it, chapter 5 or something like that, right, in the book. And his argument is actually, I think, sort of a little bit more firm on the end of like, this isn't really yoga. For me, it who knows, right? Because ultimately, images can really only tell us, right, like something that's
Well,
couched in the
also, yeah,
framing that we're already using.
and it begs the
Um,
question: what's the yoga posture? Because as you say, the Egyptians could, we could say the Egyptians doing,
exactly.
this, they could be doing yoga. So what is it
hmm
exactly that
hmm
we're saying, or we're saying a body movement is a yoga posture? Is
Yeah,
there
I mean,
any?
it's every time I sit, like I'm sitting cross-legged right now. Am I doing yoga? Like,
Mm, mm.
right? It's not really just about putting the body into a particular shape. I think any practitioner would immediately recognize that, right? Like we put our bodies into shapes all day long. There's something additional that's happening, right? When we sort of actively and consciously engage in what we call our yoga practice. Um, and so yeah, I mean, given that all we have is the shape of the body as it's making it on this seal, fundamentally, right? I mean, we can't know what this image is actually depicting. I mean, if we had some, complex narrative attached to it, then sure, but we don't. All we have is the image, and so right,
It's
like you
just
can't you can't tell what's going on
it's
inside by looking at the outside.
it's say. I mean, as you say in the more recent book, it's just so messy. I mean, it's kind of tantalizing and kind of and frustrating as well because you look one way and it's like you get one thing, and it's like you look into another text and you get another description, right? And it's like you just want a cohesive narrative of yoga. And you look at the Pradipika in the 15th century, the 16th century, and you go, okay, that seems to do it. But then it's like, well, what came before that? Like where did that come from, right? I mean,
Right, right.
I mean, our modern, we look at the Pradipika now because it's like a little bit more in line with the modern stuff. It goes a bit more into the therapeutic stuff, right? Like it's a bit BKS Iyengar, like you do this thing and you get that, But I mean, I'm trying to prime you here generally, but my understanding of it is, I mean, along probably with speaking to James a bit, is the more early days of yoga posture or yoga, whatever that meant, it was generally a static held posture for the benefit of aestheticism, really, for the aims of. Is that right?
I mean, yeah, that's definitely how I understand his argument, and it's a very compelling argument.
Right.
I think on the physical stuff, especially, like I buy whatever he's selling 100%.
I
Well,
do
because it
too.
makes
I
sense.
quite like
It
him.
makes sense
Yeah,
that in
yeah.
order to kind of achieve some of these ends, where yeah, you're really like you need to very tightly control the body.
Yeah, he uses
Like,
the term of bloody mindedness. You know that one. I've said it loads of times now because it's an English expression, right? Like he said, like with his idea of hatha being forceful, it's just like doing anything in kind of like stubborn, just being really stubborn, right? It's pretty good. What about that for a definition of yoga? Just stubbornness.
stubbornness.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, why not, right?
Yeah.
Well, persistence, right?
Yeah. That's
Your practice needs to be sort of persistent in order to
yeah.
succeed. I mean, I think I think that where I kind of diverge with what James Mallinson usually sort of tends to argue, right, is that I'm willing to rope a lot more stuff under the yoga tent, right? I mean, like he likes the aesthetic stuff, like that's kind of
Yeah,
his
yeah.
jam.
Well, he
And we
was
all
kind
have
of
our
one,
things.
so yeah, yeah. I mean, he kind of
Hmm.
lived as one for many years, so kind of
Yeah, and
understandable,
I
really.
I
Yeah, he
think
was
that
a
like
sadhu. Yeah,
yeah, for those
yeah,
physical practices to explain where those come from, to explain the history of those. I mean, again, 100%. I think like he's as far as I'm qualified to say, I'm going to say he's right. Um, but I think that this is where the work of folks like David White is really helpful too, right? Because they do have these ways of kind of bringing in all that other stuff, right? The kind of the maybe more this worldly kind of non-aesthetic, the
mm,
sort of vaguely power hungry stuff.
yeah,
David does a lot with, yeah, I mean that metaphor of the rigging, right? The way that it plugs into all these kind
yeah.
of ancient
I
Vedic
suppose, yeah.
cosmologies.
We don't really want to hear that. That's the thing, isn't it? I think, I mean, it's easy to hear more James's take than David's take, which was a little bit more shocking. As I'd seen,
Hmm.
read a little bit about this idea of the ancient yoga being more like a sorcery in a way, right? But
Mm.
it doesn't gel with the current ideas of what we'd like to think we were doing,
Right,
guys. I'm
right.
in the yoga class on my mat, trying to do some kind of voodoo so I can get power.
Well, and I mean, this is actually my little soapbox, right? I think that sorcery and magic and all this stuff gets such a bad rap because,
True.
I mean, we frame it in our modern ways of thinking about the world,
Mm-mm.
right?
Mm-mm.
And so, I mean, it's almost like it's a kind of science versus magic or religion kind of question, right? Where the way that we have of approaching our world today is through this kind of modern scientific, right? This sort of very like biophysically founded lens of understanding the body, understanding its internal processes. Um, but if you rewind even a couple hundred years or so, like there's nothing that's not steeped in these what we would today call kind of supernatural ways of understanding the world, right? So,
Mm-mm.
like trying to manipulate reality through things that we call sorcery wouldn't have been kind of mystical or irrational, right? If you again just go back like a few hundred years, it's simply one thing that we might do based on our contemporary understanding of the world.
And we're
Um,
trying to do it anyway. We're just trying to do it collectively. Say, if someone
well,
does it individually,
exactly.
you kind of say that they're a bad. So if we do it collectively as a company, kind of like as Tesla or something,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
that's a good thing, manipulating reality for good ends, right? If you do it personally, then you're some untrusted figure that might, manipulate others, I suppose.
Well, right, exactly. And
Right.
then it comes down to ethics, right? I mean, aren't we
Right.
constantly talking about ethics? And it's like
Mm.
then it's yeah, it's maybe it's the goal, right? Rather than just the basic technique that you're using. You can manipulate reality in all sorts of ways. They can have good or bad outcomes depending on why you're doing the thing.
Where do the ethics come in? That's a good point, because I mean, I've
Mm.
always thought, I don't know what you think about this, but the ethics in this Yoga Sutras kind of infatuation in the yoga world, right? It's
Mm.
like the
Hmm.
Yoga Sutras. And there's no other book about yoga apart from the Yoga Sutras, really. And as long as you know the 8 limbs, then you're pretty much
Hmm.
qualified to
Hmm.
teach,
Hmm.
right? Like,
Hmm. Hmm.
but I mean, in the first place, it seems like a lot of it's a kind of bit of a Buddhist interpolation in the Yoga Sutras, where it starts talking about Maitri, Karuna, Upekshana, and
Hmm.
it's like
Hmm.
I've heard that before somewhere else, and it doesn't strike me as particularly. Is there a background or a precedent for that? For this kind of obvious kind of almost Judeo-Christian ethics to be inserted, or certainly Buddhist ethics to be inserted in there.
That's such a good question. I just finished teaching an Indian philosophy class, right? And so inevitably I'm kind of bouncing off of my colleagues in the philosophy department who teach primarily Western stuff. And they have
Mm,
their habitual ways of kind of subdividing the stuff, right? We talk about ontology, we talk about epistemology, we talk about ethics. And it's kind of not the subdivision that really exists in the Indian material. Like it's
mm,
not that those conversations aren't happening. It's just not how we organize the material, right? There's not this sort of field where it's like, okay, now we're going to talk about ethics. It's just sort of woven through everything else. And so I think what that means is that something like ethics ends up being really contextual, right?
Right.
So, I mean, yeah, you don't, I mean, you certainly, I think, don't get like a kind of Ten Commandments style iteration of it. Um,
You kind of got that in the Yoga Sutras, haven't you?
you
I think
did,
that's
but
why it's so popular.
right. But the thing about the
Don't
Yoga Sutras, I mean, as
don't
you said,
steal,
right,
don't
it's
hurt
got this
anyone.
kind of heavy Buddhist component to it. It's also, if you look at what those commandments are, it's basically identical to the vows that Jain monks take.
Right.
Right. I mean, the kind of the five yamas are literally kind of what a person in a monastic community would sort of commit themselves to doing by virtue of having made this their entire lives. And of course, lay practitioners of something like Jainism would also adhere to a version of those vows. So I'm not saying there's not sort of broader applicability to this stuff, but I think the thing that we ignore about a text like the Yoga Sutras a lot of the time is that this really isn't meant for your sort of average person on the street, right? Even the ways that it talks about something like ethics is really embedded in this stuff that's kind of specific to a time and a place, and even like a very small subset of the population in that specific time and place, right? Where, I mean, there's a reason that they're kind of, this is the list of stuff that they're concerned with, that celibacy is on that list in particular, right? I mean, they're not saying that
Yeah.
like kind of lay practitioners should be celibate, right? That's obviously not it, because then you wouldn't have a lay community anymore.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think the way that we like to kind of like universalize this stuff, um, not that we can't kind of, speculate about what that might look like for us to translate these principles into our own lives, but like just that kind of default, like, oh, this is what it says, and so this is what we should do. That always seems really sort of iffy to me, right? Because it's like who was this ultimately put together for this system? Like it wasn't us, right? 2,000 years ago.
And it was a summing up of a lot of texts that have been before, right? That was the idea of the Patanjali Sutras, right? It was. You think it was taking Buddhism and Jainism in and putting that in, because I mean they say it's a Samkhya text, right, or it's a Samkhya yoga text,
Right.
Right? But I mean, it seems clear that there's this other aspect which is really concerned with ethics, which I don't know.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
would in such a way that I don't know whether you see ethics being talked about like that in the Rig Veda or anything, any of the preceding text to that,
Yeah, I mean, I think it is ultimately it's a text about practice, right? To some extent, it's not just philosophy. It obviously is meant to be practical and it's meant to be applied. This is something that, yeah, a community of practitioners would maybe not use, right, as like a textbook or something like that. 'Cause, I mean, sutras just sort of are conducive to that as a format. You need a teacher, right? You need that.
It's kind of
sort
a glossary,
broader,
really, isn't it? It's kind of like
yeah,
a
exactly.
bibliography or a glossary.
Little bullet points.
Yeah, yeah,
I think that's
yeah,
actually I got that from Edwin Bryant back when he first introduced me to the Yoga Sutras. He used to
yeah.
have this line where it's like, imagine you just found the bullet points to somebody's lecture that they were giving, and like try to like kind of extrapolate their entire lecture from that. Like that's what we are doing when we're looking at the Yoga Sutras, right? I mean, there's so much material that a teacher would really have to fill in for you. And so I think that, it's like when we look at the ancient world, we like to think about it in terms of these like discrete, like here's a text, right? And somehow we imagine we can just get everything that we would need from this text, and that this text actually represents a kind of discrete position that, is in its own little hermetically sealed bubble. That's not kind of like by default in conversation with everything else that's going on around it. Right. So yeah, the Yoga Sutras it's a Sankhya text, right? It's a Sankhya position, but Sankhya is never kind of evolving on its own, right? It's constantly in conversation with these Jain or these Buddhists or these, whatever, pick your other favorite philosophical school, right? These other points of view. The way that they do evolve, right, is that they're constantly sort of arguing with one another. It's this way. No, actually, it's this other way. And so, I mean, to me, it's actually really much more helpful to read all that stuff kind of side by side, right? And in comparison to one another, because often what they're doing is kind of offering, diverging, sometimes by a lot, sometimes by really a little, right? Not that much, but competing takes that are ultimately answers to the same set of questions, right? I mean, they're dealing with the same kind of reality. They're living in the same world. And so, yeah, I think to that extent, like it's really helpful to put the Yoga Sutras in that context, where they were probably composed, collated, right? Because as you said, it is sort of
Yeah,
pulling
yeah,
a
yeah,
lot of
yeah,
material.
yeah, yeah. What else? I mean, just on a practical note, what I mean, if people wanted to read outside the Yoga Sutras and they were, a yoga student of
Mm.
asana, hatha yoga, whatever you want to call that, right? What would you recommend as a point? Because I think it's like we try and read the Vedas and it's like forget that,
Right.
and then there's like some mentions like the Ashtavakra Gita or something like that because it's kind of like a little
Hmm.
bit Advaita, and Advaita is really popular, right?
Right.
You go to the Pradipika, it's like what do you think? Where would you start?
I mean, I think my first question is like, what are you looking to get out of this? Right? Like, I
Right,
wouldn't read Aristotle trying to like get an understanding of modern biology. Like that's just
yeah,
not what's going on there, right?
right,
And
right,
so
right,
if you
right,
want to
yeah,
understand the history, if you want to understand the philosophy, then yeah, sure. I mean, the Yoga Sutras are a great place to start. The Bhagavad Gita is a great place to start. All those Upanishads, right? I mean, the medieval texts obviously are already doing something different, right? So you really sort of need to understand like what medieval tantra would have looked like in order to get what's going on there. Um, and I mean, I think sometimes we tend to kind of like romanticize and a little bit exoticize these Indian sources, where
mm,
like they exist in this sort of timeless way for us. And some of that I think is valid, right? In some sense, I think the reason that we still read some of these ancient philosophers, whether they're Western, whether they're Indian, whether they're Chinese, is because there is something timeless there. But at the same time, um, we have to sort of acknowledge like where they were coming from and what we're hoping to get out of that material. Right, where we can't necessarily read it as though it were written today, as though it's speaking to the same kind of social or even just like ontological environment, right? That their ways of understanding the world are the same as ours. So for
mm.
me, actually, like reading the work of teachers that are more embedded, that are maybe 20th century gurus or something like that, who are more embedded in our modern world, but are still usually coming from a lineage where they were initiated into a particular traditional form of practice. That's been really helpful. Right. So thinking about like my first book that was actually my dissertation was on Yogananda, right? Thinking about what Yogananda was up to when he was adopting Kriya Yoga for this sort of, new Western audience.
Mm, mm,
Um, I mean, even somebody like Vivekananda, right? Like his
mm,
ways of kind of talking about science and all that stuff are outdated by our standards because
mm,
he's writing this stuff in the 1890s. But it's already so much closer, right, in terms of how it's understanding all
mm,
these
mm,
practices
mm.
than if we were to look at medieval material even. So yeah, like modern teachers, I think is actually where I would start, and then almost like sort of work back from there, um,
Yeah, that's a good bit of
right?
advice. Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you haven't read Autobiography of Yogi, you've got to read that.
Oh
It's
yeah, I
fantastic.
mean,
Yeah, it's fantastic.
classic.
Yeah, yeah. What about don't you think that today though? I mean, maybe we're closer in the in the way that we approach asana in the regular yoga class in a more tantric perspective. If we wanted to label it than an ascetic one, I mean,
Sure.
like if you say to people like, you know, think of yoga in ascetic terms, and you need to be celibate, and you
Hmm.
need to kind of like tapas, you live a kind of whipping yourself, right? Like
Hmm.
people are
Hmm.
really not going to be up for that, If you say like it's a continuation of emotional thread, etc. It seems like that's
Hmm.
closer to where actually the tantric understanding or the Buddhist understanding is closer to our current yoga perspective than the yoga perspective or the
Hmm. Hmm.
Sanatana Dharma perspective.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that generally. And I think some of that is simply because, I mean, Buddhist traditions, right, obviously sort of evolved to have this really robust kind of, again, that lay community, right, that practice that's really there for like regular people who aren't monks and nuns. I think the same is true about Tantra. It's not that there weren't sort of hardcore, like initiated practitioners who really like sort of pulled back and like that's all they did. But
Yeah.
this is something that's really meant to like kind of engage with life as it is in the world, which is like the opposite of the ascetic perspective, right? I mean, the whole point is that you remove yourself from the world, and so I mean, it would be on par with saying that every Christian needs to go become like a monk or a nun or something like that. right? I mean,
Yeah.
that to us seems like such an odd way to approach that religion because of how it's historically evolved, right? I mean, this is something that a small subset of people would do. And then,
Sure.
everybody else kind of has their own, more worldly, more
Yeah.
engaged kind of version. And so I
Yeah.
think
Pay
yoga
the priest
operates
to
in
do something
similar
for
ways.
you. Yeah.
Right. Or have your own, kind of private practice that's embedded in the rest of what you're doing. That doesn't necessarily seek to kind of retreat from the world, right? That acknowledges the fact that you exist in the world.
And you
And so,
think
yeah, I mean,
and that's not in contradiction to let's say traditional or older text, right? That's not what we're currently doing with yoga. When we say, I mean, if you ask someone, what do you think? I mean, I've done loads of these podcasts right now, or whatever we're doing, right? And then I ask them, what do you think of yoga? What's the aim of yoga? What do you think? To be a better person, right? Like, if I hear this one more time, I'm going to headbutt Ganesh, right? But is that? I mean, is there a precedent for that in any of the texts you've read, or is it always something up there?
I think absolutely there. I mean,
Right.
I just finished teaching this class, right? We finished by reading the Gita. And in a sense, I think that's actually Krishna's whole argument, right? I mean, if you sort of imagine how the thing unravels, it's like, I mean, they're on this battlefield, right? Arjuna's panicking because he's like about to go kill his entire family, which is a very valid reason to, have
Fair
an
enough. Yeah.
Right? Nothing he's doing is like incomprehensible to us from a human perspective. And what's the first thing he does? He sits down, he says, I renounce, right? Like, that's it. I'm done. I'm out. And Krishna tells him, like, actually, that's not really like the right way to do things. Like, you're not gonna get anywhere by renouncing. Like, it's hard. And it's actually sort of contrary, right, to all these other duties that you have as a person who is embedded in society. Right. I mean, and let's bracket for a second that he's actually sort of making like a pro-war argument there.
He's pretty bloodthirsty in his advice. He go into that battle, kill. Be victorious. Yeah.
But the large
people will laugh at you. People will call you names forever if you don't. Right? That's a brilliant one. That's like
masculinity going
That was your name. But don't you think there's a lot of contradiction there, though? Because at one point he's saying a renounce, all you can do is renounce. Another point he's saying it's kind of like a battle between yoga and samkhya in a way. It's a kind of calm yoga on one hand, and the kind of at other points he says no, the best yoga is kind of like pulling back. At other points he seems to say and
he does. I mean, I think it's because like what he's really trying to do in that text is answer that question of is this yoga? With like, yes, it is. In fact, guess what? Almost anything can be yoga if you approach it in the right way, right? And this is where, I mean, actually, it's so kind of masterful what's going on in that text, right? Because it is using this kind of what I understand is more of like a Buddhist perspective. This is following, I think, Bronkhorst's work actually. Where he's kind of argued that within maybe a tradition like Jainism, it's really about kind of like not doing, right?
Yes.
Really you materially detach from reality. Within Sankhya, it's kind of it's sort of a knowing, right? Like you are Purusha, you're Atman, and that's it.
But then Samkhya is not expressly advocating quietism, is it? Samkhya, it's not.
No. It's just the same way.
That's just the method. But often they also say, as an aside, you hear this idea that Samkhya is atheistic. I'm a bit confused there, but I've heard people say this. But I mean, it's like if the Yoga Sutras is Samkhya, and this is a bit of a sidebar, I suppose, then the Yoga Sutras is clearly theistic, right?
Right. Well, Ishvara right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, and I forget now who is it that's made this argument. But I mean, the reason that we think that Sankhya is atheistic is, first of all, because we're using kind of our very specific Western lens of what theism even entails, right? That there's this God with a capital G figure that's like the creator and sustainer of the world, which exists in the Indian material, but it's really not the only model of theism. But also that, like, I mean, we're working with such limited sources. Right? Like, we really don't have a full picture of what every philosopher that understood themselves to be writing within the Sankhya school would have said. And so, there are these kind of more atheistic variants of Sankhya, where, I mean, at best, if God is a thing, God is just sort of a special Purusha. right? It's actually sort of what the Yoga Sutras say, right? Ishvara is a Purusha Vishesha, right? So like
Distinct.
we
Yeah,
can
yeah,
be
yeah, yeah.
like that essentially. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think it's another one of those cases where it's like the access to that material that we have is so limited that to make these statements like, oh, Sankhya was always atheistic is just like we're really only scratching the surface of what Sankhya was, I think, to some extent.
I want to come back to the Gita before that distraction and say what text again for the listenership. What text would you recommend translation wise? I will. If you're Edwin, you always say you have to read it in Sanskrit. But if
Well, of course
I
you
mean,
do.
yeah, but other than Edwin's, encouraging the Sanskrit, what if you were to read it in the God forbid in the in
Right.
English, what translation would you recommend?
Well, so I usually, when I teach the Gita, I actually stack translations. Because
Right.
I mean, if you're not going to read it in the Sanskrit, right, I think it's really interesting to see how different translators approach the same passage. I mean, you don't necessarily have to read the whole thing in three versions, right? But if there are those crucial passages that you're really like, what is this saying? The more versions you have, the better, right?
Yeah.
And so for something that's kind of just, sort of lyrical, and I think trying to represent the text as poetry, which is what it is, I really like the Barbara Stoller Miller translation.
Okay.
I think it's called something like Krishna's Counsel in a Time of War, or something like that is the way she translates it. Um, the more I think kind of technical translation, which will give you the Sanskrit, Miller's will not, that I really enjoy is one that Edwin Bryant used to use. I don't know if he still uses this one. Um, oh gosh, and I'm not going to remember the author's first name now, but the last name is Dasa. And
Okay.
it's
Right.
called
You can
something
get
like the
it from
Bhagavad
there.
Gita, right?
Yeah. Bhagavad Gita,
Dasa.
probably. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
And then there's a sort of very technical translation that's like, I mean, the book is like this thick, where it parses the Sanskrit word for word for you. It's what they usually use in like second year Sanskrit classes because it kind of shows you how to like break things up and how to do all that translation. And that's Winthrop Sargent, I believe, is that version. Where I mean, it's not kind of a fun read in the way that the Miller translation is, right? Because it's really not really trying for kind of like lyricism and artistry at that point. It's
Yeah.
just
Yeah. Yeah.
like what are these words? And so I
I
think
mean,
stacking those three.
Yeah, yeah. So you can compare. I mean, yeah, and get a kind of
hmm
get a rounded view of what it is. I mean, on another note, I was going to say, how important is the Sanskrit for you? Do you feel it's when studying yoga, you need to know that, or
again, it depends on what you're hoping to get out of the thing, right?
right, right, right.
I mean, and I'm kind of a language nerd. Even with like, I mean, you'll find me like Googling like the etymology of things on my phone constantly, right? Because I think like not that
It's
words
fascinating.
mean the
Yeah,
same
yeah,
thing
yeah, yeah,
today,
yeah,
right? But like
yeah.
it's so interesting to see where the word comes from, right? And like I think sometimes that can help us get at those like kind of really like below the surface kind of like connotations that are embedded there in the history of the term that we may not necessarily be thinking of when we just kind of use it in everyday speech. Um, and so I would say to understand kind of the historical evolution of yoga, to sort of have that depth. That is, I mean, it's an academic project ultimately. Absolutely, the Sanskrit is important. I think if you are viewing yourself as practicing yoga, right? The fact that this is something that really comes from India is important to you, the Sanskrit, I think, is kind of a important piece of honoring that, right? Even though obviously there's all sorts of issues within the Indian context with, the way that Sanskrit is kind of like that's an elite language, right? It's often kind of juxtaposed to more vernacular, kind of non-Brahminical stuff. So I think that there's a crucial place, right, that Sanskrit has, both in the history of yoga and the way that we still deal with yoga today. Um, can you do your asana practice if you don't know any Sanskrit? Like, of course you
Evidently
can,
so.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, again, it's like, do you need to like read, Latin and ancient Greek and like Syriac in order to like read the Bible? Like, I mean, we don't normally tell people that, right? Like that's not like the rigor that's required. Can you still get something out of the thing without knowing five ancient languages? Like, of course you can, right? It's just the thing you're going to get out of it is not going to be the same as you
I
would
think,
if you were
yeah.
to engage with the original.
I think it's this idea of tradition and traditional, right? And and I think more recently, I mean, the furore that Mark Singleton's book on the yoga body created was just to demystify the idea that maybe Krishnamacharya hadn't got the postures from 1,000-year-old yoga
Right.
Karunta or wherever it was, right? That it was kind
Right,
of, and
right,
you
right.
make a chapter about yoga. Harmoniism, is it harmonialism gymnastics or
Harmonialism.
something? Right?
Yeah, harmonial
Yeah,
gymnastics.
yeah. I mean, and this I think really disappoints people to some degree, right? Because they kind of want to have a
Right,
the
right, right,
idea
right.
that this is the way it was, exactly the way it was. I mean, how do you see that creeping in? I mean, is there any at what point can we trace what we're currently doing back, or can we at all? Because I mean, as far as I could see, the precedent really is only like a static postures for tapas for the sake of tapasya, you know.
So, I mean, yeah, again, and this is where I think like having that historical mindset is really helpful, right? Like, think about literally anything in
Yeah.
our modern world today, right? Like medicine, right? Let's think about medicine. How far back can you trace truly modern medicine? I mean, even if you go back 100 years, like they have all sorts of funky ideas about, what the pituitary gland does. That doesn't mean that the kind of the evolution, right, of that tradition of these ways of understanding the mind, the body, right, like the nervous system, that there's nothing of that to be found if you read,
Mm-mm.
Galen or Aristotle or something like that. It's just that you can't go back to a source that's 2,000 years old and expect to find something that's like this close to where we're at today, right? It doesn't mean the connection's not there. It means the connection is 2,000 years in the past. And there's really a lot of stuff that happens in between. And so, is modern yoga practice completely discontinuous with ancient tradition? Well, no, because nothing is, right? But ancient tradition is not kind of the closest link that gets us to where we are today. Like you can't look at a link from 2000 years ago and hook it up to the one from today and expect the
Mm.
two to match up perfectly, right? It's literally like not how human history works. Um, but if you do trace, right, if you kind of go through
Mm-hmm.
that 2000 years worth of material, absolutely there's continuity there, right? It's just that stuff evolves gradually. It doesn't sort of stay the same and then like boom, suddenly you have a whole other thing, right? It's always this kind of constantly changing, flowing web, right? It's not even really sort of a chain of links. It's
Mm-mm.
so much messier than that, right?
I
That
mean,
if you're
I
going to
think
look
the
for continuity, you have to look broader.
what about the harmonialism, as I
Hmm.
understand it, and from what you say, is about balancing the body, right? I mean, it's quite strongly to do with the kind of purification of the body, and it comes to you mentioned Western, like the Western world, America, right, in the
Hmm.
1900s, and it's kind of brought in as something which is kind of separate ourselves, or it's very visual and it's very kind of health based, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I think some of that is kind of the legacy of, how we, even from, let's say the Renaissance onwards within that Western European context, we've been slowly kind of trying to pry apart the stuff that's medical and scientific and kind of this worldly, right, from the stuff that's spiritual and that somehow is otherworldly. Because within a kind of Western Christian context, the spiritual stuff often is imagined as otherworldly, right? Heaven is out there; it's not right here.
Yeah.
Even though there are a lot of historical figures that would disagree with that, right? Including a bunch of the guys that I look at in that book when I'm talking about the harmonial tradition. But I think so because of that, there's been this kind of divergence, right? Where yeah, the stuff that deals with the body and practices of the body and breath often tends to be kind of like there's always this gesture of like, well, but like this can be spiritual, right? And let me show you the hidden spiritual dimensions of gymnastics or something like that, right? Because it's almost like it's in this constant state of like recovery, right? I mean, and it's the same if you go, no matter how far back you go, they're just constantly recovering this stuff. Because I guess it's just getting lost, right? Like just over and over and over again. It never seems to like stabilize. In the Indian context with yoga traditions, especially with Tantra, I mean, we just don't have that, right? It's there's such closer integration between what's understood to be the body and what's understood to be kind of the spiritual. Whereas
Mm-mm-mm.
in the Western material that I think informs a lot of Western yoga practice, I think that's why we have such a hard time with understanding that like asana itself, right, can be this sort of deeply spiritual thing, right? That the body is not kind of separate from those
Mm-mm-mm.
pursuits, right? Because for so long, like we've been like struggling with this idea that like, well, we are separate, right? And we have to bring it back together. Um, and so, I mean, the harmonial stuff kind of, I guess, gets at that portion of Western history where like these things really have been more tightly integrated than we would think if, we just look at mainstream Christianity or mainstream
Mm-mm.
kind of Enlightenment era science or something like that. But yeah, even on my part, right? Like I also am feeling like I'm constantly trying to like recover this stuff when I work with these sources.
And what about yoga therapy? The idea, I mean, how far does that go? Because people are very interested in this. As I mentioned earlier, Iyengar, kind of classically, right? Like this asana will cure the bad fat of
Right.
the waist. It's always the bad fat of the waist, generally, like or
Mm-hmm,
some kind of problems with the urethra or piles or stuff like that.
mm-hmm.
How far does that go back?
I
Can you?
mean, I think actually, again, yeah, there's if you look at kind of what James Ballinson is doing, what Singleton and Birch have been doing, there's a lot of kind of medieval onwards iterations of how these ways of kind of like manipulating the body through certain asanas, for instance, can have these medical therapeutic benefits. I think it was Jason Birch that made this argument. He's got like a whole piece on Ayurveda and yoga, right, and how the relationship basically that these two traditions have historically had. And I mean, he kind of, he doesn't really come down firmly one way or the other. He's like, well, like there are places where you can see these two schools of thought, let's call them, working together. On the other hand, like you can also see places where it almost seems like they're in competition, right? That like the Ayurvedic
Mm,
doctors and the yogis are like, well, like, I can heal you better. Um, I mean, and there again, I think for me, it all comes back to like, let's talk about like what that historical context would have looked like. Of
mm,
course, yogic texts are, I mean, insofar as they have any understanding of just what's physically going on within the body, that understanding cannot be separate from what's going on within Indian medicine at the time, right? They don't necessarily always agree in the same way that if you look at sort of certainly pre-modern medicine, right, where there's not kind of just an
yeah. Mm,
institutionalized like this is the canon, right?
yeah.
People will disagree, right? I mean, again,
Mm.
in ancient Greece, they disagreed about whether the brain or the heart was responsible for thought, basically, right? I mean, that's a pretty fundamental disagreement.
Yeah.
And so it's not shocking, right, that you look at the Indian material and they don't necessarily have kind of a consistent understanding of the body. Of course, they don't. But I think the idea that yoga is something that's connected with the body is a very old idea, and you find that kind of, I mean, from as far back as you can go, and it's certainly there in the ascetic material, right? I mean, fundamentally, these ascetic techniques are about manipulating like the physical functions of the body. It may not be with the goal of kind of healing, right? It's not medicine,
Mm.
but it's still relying on the same framework, right? It's just that
Mm.
it has this sort of alternate goal of almost, again, like shutting down the body, right?
Yeah, I think one point you make is a fundamental one that people don't realise often when reading the text is that there's usually an opposition, right? The context is usually arguing against an opposition, and because the current world we're living in, I mean, we don't allow that opposition. That there's less and less a lack of the ability to argue. Say, I mean, Edwin says the current opposition we have is science, right? But there's not so much of the ability to parlay between the two fronts without just entering into polemics.
Right.
Yeah, it's just tolerance would be nice. And
Yeah, yeah. Well,
open-mindedness, in between the two
dialogue,
fields.
right?
Yes, yeah. But finally to end it with you, it's been a really nice to share time with you. What about you? I mean, what about has your academic background and your studies, etc., changed your yoga? I assume you got into yoga before your studies and becoming an academic. Has anything changed for you? Do you see a discrepancy between the two? Is there a conflict? Has it developed your personal aims of what you're doing? Can you say anything about that, just to round it off?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? And you're absolutely right. I mean, effectively, I became a yoga scholar because I was a yoga practitioner, right?
Yeah, I imagine so. Yeah.
And for me, I mean, really where I was coming from, like I was one of those folks that I really wanted to understand my asana practice as something that wasn't just glorified gymnastics, right? It
Yeah.
confused
Yeah.
me that I didn't recognize my practice in the Yoga Sutras. I really wanted it to be this kind of like consistent. I mean, this is before Mark Singleton's Yoga Body
Yeah.
came
Yeah.
out,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
talking
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
2006,
Yeah.
2007 here.
Right. Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean that was this was very much as my books are academic projects. It was also very much a personal project for me. Um, and I think that for me, what's been really important in terms of just my own practice, right? Not even just intellectually, but really coming to peace with that idea that I was trying to articulate earlier, that it's okay that we can't look back 2,000 years and recognize ourselves. Like it would be shocking if we could, because that would mean that like human civilization just functions in wildly different ways than we might expect it to. Um, and so I think kind of embracing that, like the both and, right? Both tradition is important, and also like tradition evolves, right? Concepts change, our ways of understanding the world change. It doesn't even necessarily mean that there's not truth out there, right? It just
Mm.
means that I mean, historically, it would be unprecedented to say that we found because we've been wrong about how we view the world just as long as we've lived in it, basically. Um, so I actually kind of
But
struggle now to articulate what it is that I'm doing when I do yoga, but it's
I finally
productive.
got you. Finally. But I mean, doesn't yoga have the idea of objective truth? I mean, isn't that one of the things we might say is a definition of yoga, that there is this belief in an objective, true
Yeah,
reality?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, so even an enlightened guru doesn't go around shouting about how enlightened they are, right? Like I'm not saying that it's impossible. Um, but I certainly wouldn't claim to have gotten there. Right? I mean, even if we have this sort of ideal of, yeah, it's about enlightenment, it's about transcendence, it's about truth. Who of us can say, right, that that's actually sort of where we're hanging out right now? And
Mm-mm.
I think to me, right, like embracing that idea of like uncertainty and like the not knowing has been really healthy.
Does it matter about your notions of self, though? I mean, that's the one thing I might say might qualify a practice in terms of how you view the self, right? If you're viewing it in a kind of Buddhist context where there's no inherent self, there's a sense of fluidity, that the self is aggregates in terms of an experience that's happening, but it's constantly in process. And then you've got the Purusha, that's like a thing that's inherent,
Yeah.
right? Like you're going to protect that thing and it's going to carry on, and you better care about that because it's going going out there. I mean, would you say that affects the aims of your practice or anyone's practice? Is it important to know what kind of self you're considering?
I think it is, but again, that's me kind of speaking as somebody who is just like a really big nerd and like sitting around and thinking about this stuff, right? Like, do I think it's crucial to everyone's practice? Like, no, right? I would never dictate what's crucial to everyone's
Yeah,
practice.
no, we wouldn't do that.
And that
No.
being said, I mean, I think I'm really, if I were to like pick a camp, I'm probably more of a Buddhist, ontologically speaking. And maybe that kind of like the Madhyamaka style Buddhist, where it's like, like we don't really have a grip on like ultimate reality. Like that's really sort of beyond, right, our human conceptions. To have a grip on that, we would have to become something radically different. And so, I mean, let's practice, right? Let's do the best that we can with what we have and see what happens. And again, sort of embrace the fluidity and the not knowing. Like that itself, right? That's a philosophical position, even
Mm-mm.
though it's kind of like a very agnostic one.
All right. Wonderful. Yeah. I think we'll leave it there, Anya. It was really, really good.
Agnosticism is always where
yes,
we
yeah.
just leave things.
Leave it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We haven't come to any conclusions, but if you haven't done so, please look at Anya's work and her books. And they're really, really inspiring. And thanks for coming on, Anya. I really appreciate
Thank
your
you so
time.
much.
Thank you. Right.